Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Sandra Fahy. This is the second in a two-part podcast, both focused on Sandra's book, Dying for Rights, putting North Korea's human rights abuses on record. The preceding podcast focused on the crimes and human rights abuses inside North Korea. And today we're going to follow the structure of Sandra's book and focus this second podcast on the denials from North Korea. How North Korea have responded to these significant human rights accusations, such as with the United Nations Commission of Inquiry. How internal media covers such events. The unique threat posed to the regime in Pyongyang from defector testimony, and how the regime treats defectors when they speak out in this way. And importantly, what details we can gather from the language North Korea uses. Sandra is incredibly good at analysing language, and this was a large part of her first book, which is also a podcast that we did, which will be linked below. And here she does a wonderful job of digging in to the subtleties here and the rhetoric, pulling out the inconsistencies and the slight messaging that North Korea are sending to their own citizens and also to the international community through these often emotional denials. Now, this podcast, as I said, is a buttress to a previous podcast. It does stand by itself, but it will begin abruptly because we cut the previous podcast in half. So this one will begin with me launching into a question which takes us into the second half of Sandra's book. And just as I said in the previous podcast, there will be some background noise from Sandra's cats. It only happens occasionally, it's only slight, and it doesn't affect in any way the overall interview. In fact, if anything, I believe it adds something. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. We do not run advertising in any way. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast directly at the PayPal or Patreon link attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. All the help in this regard is greatly appreciated. On that, and to walk us through the second half of her book, Dying for Rights, putting North Korea's human rights abuses on record, this is Sandra Fahy. So let's step into the second half of the book here. So the first half is about the crimes. The second half is titled The Denials. And this is a really interesting insight into North Korean behavior itself. So the crimes are laid out in huge detail throughout the book, even though we haven't been able to touch on them all here. But the section on the denials is a real interesting insight into how North Koreans see the world, and particularly how the North Korean regime sees the world. And it's almost have this performative art aspect to a lot of it. So I might touch with this idea of foreign nationals. Now, you talk about the Americans crossing the border like James Dresnock and people like this, and you talk about poets like Ali Lameda and missionaries like Kenneth Bay. But I'm going to focus on Otto Warmbier, just because a lot of people will know exactly who he is and they know exactly his nature of his crime, and or crime in inverted commas there. And what I'm going to put here is a very interesting thought experiment, because people saw what he did. He stole a poster and he was given, I believe it was 10 or 15 years hard labor for the crime. And you write 15. Here, 15. And this is you write here, and this is interesting because this is not North Korea just having strict punishments for certain infractions because they're scared that if infractions happen, there's going to be a certain rebellion inside the country. This is, as you write here, it became an opportunity to flip the shame game campaign by literally naming and shaming someone outside the country. So it became North Korea's opportunity to turn around the charges that have been coming at them in some ways. The whole world has been saying things about North Korea like you're breaching human rights, etc., etc. And the opportunity to turn this around and return the shame is something that North Korea are revel in some ways. It's a huge opportunity for them.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've seen that video as well. That is purported to be Otto Warmbier taking down that poster. It's difficult to see if it is in fact him. And I spoke to a friend of mine who's also a professor expert on North Korea, and he doubts that video is in fact Otto Warmbier. But I haven't done any forensic analysis on the video. It'd be very difficult to say. Yeah, this was a great opportunity for North Korea, and they like to use the language of law, quote unquote, the language of law. They like to evoke the language of law or the language of human rights. In this case, they didn't evoke the language of human rights. They just evoked the language of law and kind of crimes that have been committed against us or wrongs that have been committed against us, and punishment. Of course, that punishment is seen on camera, so you can see our, how our system works. We'll hold a press conference. We will let Otto Warmbier make an apology. We're keeping the communication open between North Korea and various American representatives who might be willing to advocate on his behalf. It's an attempt for North Korea to appear as if it operates like an ordinary, non-totalitarian, non-authoritarian state. The problem, of course, is that it's a profoundly authoritarian, totalitarian practice, what comes across. And especially with an American, North Korea did detain the young Alex, drawing a blank on his last name.
Oh, yes. I forget his last name too, yes.
Yeah, it's terrible because, I know him quite well. But anyway, they did detain him. Australians are less useful. It's Americans.
Quigley, I believe his last name was.
Right. Mm. Americans are who they really want. Americans, that's a particularly valuable, it's a valuable asset for them to have.
So let's step into a very interesting phenomena, and I'm really interested on your take in this, because this is one of those things that are very hard to explain in some ways, but in other ways, as soon as you think about it, begins to make some sense. And that is a fairly, at least newly reported phenomena of double defection. So the idea that North Koreans defect from North Korea, find their way to South Korea or to a third country, and then choose to defect back home. So I might get you to touch on that. So what exactly is this phenomena of double defection, and how should we put this into context? How should people out there begin to understand why this is happening? And I'm really interested to see your views on it, and just what you think is happening in the minds of these double defectors.
So let's see, a few thoughts on this. The notion of double defection. So people have been crossing from the northern part of North Korea into China and then back into North Korea for a long time. So I suppose you could consider that defection and then return defection. But what we've seen in the last few years, what people refer to as this double defection, are cases where individuals have defected to South Korea, made it successfully to South Korea, and then for whatever host of reasons, have decided to, or have been taken back into, or let me just say, have appeared back in North Korea. That's probably the best way to put it. Sometimes these individuals have shown up on North Korean state media. Of course, this is very valuable to North Korea because, again, going back to Chang Song-taek, they get to narrate the end of the story. Like, the individual went to South Korea, experienced exploitation, discrimination in South Korea because you're from the North, it's a poor country, Pyongyang and all the rest. You're treated like a second-class citizen. Oh, life was very difficult there, so you decide to go back to North Korea, where, that's where you really belong, and you're very happy to be back. So this sort of narrative is extremely valuable. Another part of that doesn't get told, of course, is that the vast majority of individuals who would ever try to, quote unquote, return defect, like say you did go into China and, made some money or did whatever kind of hustling to get resources and then went back to North Korea, you'd likely have to pay a bribe, or if you got caught and refouled by state authorities, whether Chinese or North Korean, you could face detention and a political prison camp. So that, of course, doesn't get that part of the story gets left out. Mm-hmm. Though it could still be on offer. There's a few things I want to say here. One is that life. North Koreans, when they leave North Korea, they are effectively in exile from their home country. I guess some equivalents might be, you think of somebody who's a refugee from the West Bank. I mean, the ability to get back is so difficult. It's as if the country doesn't exist anymore. And to be able to relay information, to stay in touch with family. Of course, this is all very difficult and clandestine. It's not like moving. It's not like, even it's not like leaving a war-torn country. I mean, you are passing from, I hate to say it, but it's almost like you're passing from one world into another. And it would be very difficult to step back into that old world again, for various reasons. But North Koreans have a very difficult time in South Korea. It is unequal for them. Yes, they have freedoms, but moving into that type of culture and society is very difficult. South Korea, as you know, is very ambitious. Some defectors end up in Japan. Japan has about 200 of them. They have ties to Japan, of course. They're Zainichi, by and large. Some are in the UK, some are in the United States, various parts of Europe. But they have a lot of difficulties. They're totally separated from their family. Who knows what kind of persecutions their families experienced as a result of their defection. Or you can think of the young Joseph Kim, who was a defector. I think his entire family died before he, as a gochebi, as a child orphan, left North Korea. So you're talking about a population that is really hobbled, for lack of a better word, socially, perhaps in terms of education, absolutely in terms of financial resources. These are refugees quite unlike many other refugees in the world in terms of their precarity. But on the issue of the return defection, this is something that North Korea really likes to hype, particularly in their media and particularly in the last few years, because it's an excellent opportunity for them to discount the story that's put forward by South Korea. If you've got 30,000 people who have chosen South Korea over North Korea, this is an embarrassment to North Korea. So if they can have one or two or three on camera, whether willingly or otherwise, there's some stories, just incidentally, I should add, that maybe some of these return defections are in fact women who had gone into China hoping to get access to their children who are stateless, who are born perhaps of their unions with Chinese men, and then while in the region, they are captured and brought back into North Korea by North Korean authorities. So there's this question. And then Andrei Lankov has written that maybe some of these people were in fact actually spies. They pretended to be defectors when they actually weren't. So, your listeners can at this moment appreciate the complexities of these things. You can't just assume right away. So many different factors.
So from those factors, let's talk about North Korea's responses, because a lot of what we've been speaking about is the crimes and the accusations against North Korea, but it is very interesting to see how they respond, and it's insightful into North Korean mindset themselves and how they see their own crimes. So we'll start with what is often their most instinctive response. So you write in your book that the response to these human rights abuses inside North Korea tends to come across as a charge of hypocrisy. So if, for example, America accused them of some crime, they will accuse America of some crime. And then you write in March 15th, 2017, North Korea produced their own white paper on the human rights situation inside the United States. So let's talk about that. This tactic, this response from North Korea when they're accused of credible human rights abuses inside their own country, to deny them at first and then spend most of the time highlighting or trying to draw attention not to themselves but to the human rights abuses in other countries, or at least the accusing countries outside of themselves.
Mm-hmm. So when the United Nations put together the commission to investigate allegations of crimes against humanity that were happening in North Korea, this had been decades in the making by activist organizations, NGOs, that pushed the UN to form this commission to investigate. The three commissioners invited North Korea to participate. They wrote to North Korea on several occasions saying, please, look, here are these allegations made against your government. Let us come in, let us investigate. If these allegations are unfounded, we will make it known. And the response was that North Korea just ignored the letters. And I think, Jed, you helped me to get the answer to that question, right? Because you interview Justice Michael Kirby?
I did, but it was only in a very, very small way, I promise. I didn't do much.
Yeah, but that was great because, in fact, that hadn't been anywhere mentioned. It was from your podcast, and I did ask you, please ask Michael Kirby this question, how did North Korea respond? And he said they just ignored the letters. They just didn't write back. So that fact hasn't been recorded anywhere except now in my book and on your podcast and now here again. So why didn't North Korea say, look, let's work together? Of course, North Korea mistrusts the United Nations and yet wants the respect and the esteem that comes from being a member state of the UN. So when North Korea didn't give access, they kind of created a self-fulfilling prophecy. So they were able to say in their own human rights report and in virtually every kind of rebuttal that they offer, you haven't come to our country, so you haven't seen what's really going on here. Or they failed to mention, well, we didn't invite you into our house, but you don't know what's happening inside our house. Well, we didn't invite you, but you don't know what's happening inside our house. And then the classic thing of North Korea is, which I mentioned in the book, it's called tukok. It's a Latin term, and it basically means turning the accusation back on the accuser or accusing them of hypocrisy. So I gave the allusion earlier about the American prisons. So often on Twitter or different types of forums, I will be asked, with my expertise is on North Korea, and I will be asked why, or when I'm writing my book on the American prison system, or when I'm writing about South Korea's human rights problems, or, give me some time, happy to receive the funding to do so. But the problem with the tukok is that you're turning the accusation back on the accuser, and you're actually changing the subject that's under discussion. So it's to individuals who are perhaps a little bit unsophisticated in terms of debate or argument, or even a logical conversation, that might seem very seductive to say, oh, well, North Korea has prison camps, but what about America's prison camps? Well, we can talk about America's prison camps if you'd like to have a conversation about that later. But at the moment, we're talking about North Korea's prison camps, and this is what they're like. But the issue with North Korea's propaganda is that they don't actually acknowledge at any point any of the human rights violations that they are alleged to have violated. And in fact, the United Nations Commission of Inquiry found the North Korean state responsible at the highest level for crimes against humanity, for systematic, widespread human rights violations that are happening at a gross scale. So not letting people have freedom of movement, no free media, no freedom of expression, no freedom of religion, et cetera, et cetera. So North Korea doesn't acknowledge any of those. And of course, in the book, you can see I do a lot of computational analysis of their own media. In fact, as I was doing the research for this book, North Korea's own main news organ changed the search option on their website within 3 days of me doing the research online. So clearly, on the opposite side of the wall, they knew that somebody was interrogating their own media to see how often words like rape, torture, prison camp, forced abortion, refoulement, etc. How often these terms appeared in English and Korean. So over 3 days of doing this investigative research, they made it so you could not search anything, in fact, on KCNA's page.
That is a fascinating look at just how hypersensitive the country is. And I don't mean that in an emotional way, but just how tuned in they are to foreign eyes picking in, and how well tuned in they are to potential criticisms and threats.
Yes. And also, another thing that North Korea does very well, actually, in an extremely sophisticated manner, is these modes of argument, which are deeply, well, I don't know if I'd say they're sophisticated, but they're kind of, like on an emotional level. Of course, I care. I read up on the Innocence Project in the United States all the time. I'm aware that African American men are imprisoned at a higher rate in the United States all the time. Absolutely, it's preposterous. I am in no way an apologist for the United States prison system. I mean, the notion is preposterous. But what would happen is that in a debate or in a discussion, whether it's on Twitter or elsewhere, but anyway, within North Korean media, your mind is seduced away from the topic at hand, which is the prison camps in North Korea, the human rights violations in North Korea. Well, the North Korean media won't mention that at all. They will just simply say, nobody came into our country. We are at war. We don't have a peace treaty. Sanctions are destroying us. The U.S. is warmongering. Look at the human rights violations they have in the United States. Look at the violations they have in South Korea. We need to do an investigation about the human rights violations in America. So you see, it's actually a race to the bottom. Nothing gets accomplished. So North Korea does that very well within its media. And another thing they do is that they evoke, as I mentioned, legal language. They evoke the language of the United Nations, but they empty it of power. They're only interested in invoking human rights language in order to facilitate the power of the state and not empower human beings in North Korea to access their human rights.
There is an important message that runs through a little bit of your research at this time, and it's really quite fundamental here, and that is a thought that may not cross a lot of people's minds. That is, in North Korea's own denials, there is a kind of acceptance that they do care about human rights. Not so much that they do it in their country. Of course, the country is a human rights disaster. But if they didn't care at all when they said we don't accept human rights, they would just say that we don't accept it. But the fact that they pay lip service to human rights, the fact that they deny them in the first place, implies that they have an eye on this. They want to live up to the standard of the international community.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they call it 우리 인권. 우리식 인권, our style human rights. North Korea puts forward the idea that they have a particular approach to human rights. This is what they put, within their domestic media throughout their country. Many North Koreans will say to you, North Korean defectors will say to you, oh my gosh, I never heard the word inkwon. I never heard the word human rights. I had no idea what they're doing. But it is in their media. So perhaps, understandably so, maybe they're not reading the media, but North Korea does put forward that language. And of course, the nation's sovereignty is the right that must be absolutely upheld. And then if that right is upheld, all other rights can be respected. Well, yeah.
So let's also step into North Korea's response at the United Nations. So we've been talking about the Commission of Inquiry and Justice Kirby themselves here, but of course they rejected the allegations, but they had a response, and then they responded. This wasn't the end of it, of course. There's been a series of of North Korea's human rights returning to the United Nations over the preceding years, and North Korea have attended. In some instances, they've shouted down defectors. Some instances they have responded with their own documentation on their own internal human rights situations. Sometimes they've created white papers for other countries' human rights situations. But it has been. I'm really interested on your take on this, of what you make of North Korea's institutional response in the United Nations, because they seem to, around this moment, be making an effort to defend themselves, which is important in a lot of ways, because I've been guilty of this myself. You often think that all the effort to improve human rights in North Korea is destined to fail. You get a bit bogged down, and then you see the Commission of Inquiry, and you think, I'm not sure if it's going to achieve anything. But I'm assuming through North Korea's own fighting inside the United Nations implies that this is having an effect on them.
I do think, I agree with what you say. It's so difficult because you want to see big, massive changes. You know that people are suffering right now as we speak. Things that we cannot even imagine for things that we do every day. So, yeah, you want to see things change. And, a nearly 400-page report, Commission of Inquiry, they did an incredible job, actually. It's an incredible report, and people who are listening, I'd like them to know that the many of the testimonies are public testimonies, and they're all online and they're fully available. And many of the responses of the North Korean state representatives are also online, many of them on YouTube. You can watch these. You can see the kind of side panel projects that they'll have at the UN, different events. You can see the North Korean state representatives speaking over about these, human rights violations that the defectors are identifying. I think it's very useful to engage North Korea on these topics, to invite representatives to speak. I think it's very useful to have people like Will Ripley going into Pyongyang and carrying out these, I want to say, but these unusual interviews with, with people that the regime has organized for him to meet. It's fascinating for this reason. You have humans who are flawed, humans who are going to make mistakes, communicating with other humans. And so for me, this is a great opportunity. It brings huge risk because it threatens to legitimate North Korea. Many people say, oh, you're legitimizing North Korea. Look, it's a state. You have to engage it. You can't just ignore them. Ignoring the problem is not, yes, and perhaps it's not fair for me to call North Korea a problem, but ignoring their human rights problem is not going to make it go away. You have to engage them. And, as I say in the book, they kind of discursively hang themselves because they reveal in their rhetoric, they reveal the contradictions of themselves. As Samantha Power said at the United Nations, they're self-discrediting, allow them to speak. So for me, I think we should have as much engagement as possible. We should welcome because North Korea wrote its own human rights report, of course, as well, which I reference in the book, and I encourage everybody to read, which was a kind of counter report to the United Nations Commission of Inquiry report. And of course, if you read it very carefully, it's filled with contradictions, and there's very little mention of people at all, ironically, in a human rights report. So anyway, when North Korean state representatives spoke at the United Nations, the types of language you can see coming out of their mouths, that they're reading from scripts, is precisely the type of language you can see in the Rodong Shinmun, the KCNA website. It is, but with some nuance, because, for instance, there's an incredible, I think it was the Council on Foreign Relations hosted an ambassador from North Korea, and he took questions from the audience. Much to my frustration, nobody in the audience seemed to have read the Commission of Inquiry's report. Otherwise, and nobody seemed to have read North Korea's own human rights report. Otherwise, they could have asked him some very pointed questions, which unfortunately they didn't. But, he tried to backstep some comments that his colleague had made on a side panel at the UN. His colleague had accidentally identified that, in fact, there were re-education centers, that there were, I think he said there were prison camps. And, oh, no, but this guy's saying they're re-education centers. So in each way, you kind of inch them toward, catching themselves out.
I'm going to give a small example of that, of them catching themselves out, because this is important. And this is something you highlighted yourself. This is really interesting. North Korea, in response to some of these human rights accusations, have often said, if there are any inside the country, if people are suffering, it's because of the sanctions being imposed from countries like America. And then you write, however, during when they talk about the Korean War, they write, and this is a quote, the people's livelihood was relatively stable during the 3-year war period. There was not a single case of death due to starvation or cold, other than those killed by U.S. indiscriminate and brutal air bombing. And you write to yourself, these things are in complete contradiction. If there's no suffering from the Korean War, then there shouldn't be any suffering from sanctions. There's a statement of internal imposition of human rights violations, and at the same time trying to say, but inside we have a parent leader who is capable of protecting us against any calamity that comes our way.
And it's interesting because carrying on with that, I don't think I mentioned this in the book, but it's a contradiction I see. I call them kind of this incoherence, it doesn't even reach the level of being wrong. It's just incoherent. It just doesn't make sense. So for instance, that example of the sanctions and the war, like you'd kind of expect more people to die during war. rather than during sanctions. Well, again, this issue of sanctions is very interesting because in the contemporary, and some individuals have put a report presented a report to the United Nations, something about gender and sanctions in North Korea. But if you read the report carefully, which I would encourage people to do, please don't just read news articles about the report, because the report, again, it's incoherent because it actually it claims that North Koreans are suffering under sanctions, which are by the US, by the UN, and that women in particular are suffering very badly. But again, here's the line of incoherence. If that's the case, it suggests that prior to the sanctions, which there have been sanctions for many, many years, but let's say prior to the worst, most extreme sanctions, it implies that women and vulnerable populations were doing well, or were doing not too bad. But they couldn't have been, because then how do you justify the need for humanitarian aid that North Korea has requested so much, particularly for women in these vulnerable populations? So why is it now that these women in vulnerable populations are being identified as suffering very severely under the sanctions? Prior to the sanctions, the North Korean government wasn't providing everything that these individuals needed. If they were, in fact, doing that, then there wouldn't have been the requests for the humanitarian aid. So again, you see these kind of flaws and these kind of contradictions. Incidentally, that gender report, there's only one paragraph in the entire report that mentions gender, so it's very unusual.
As we begin to round this off a little bit, I want to focus a lot on defectors and North Korea's response to defectors, because a lot of your work has focused on defectors and your interactions with them. So I'm really fascinated to get your take on North Korea's response to defectors. As you mentioned, there has been a history of assassinating defectors inside South Korea. And
other countries too, not just South Korea.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which, of course, speaks to a concern about defectors that some people may not think should exist. For example, someone, an American, a British, an Australian can criticize North Korea and they don't like it, but they're not particularly concerned. But a defector criticizing North Korea really touches them in a certain way that they're not happy about. And in your report, you talk about two defectors. I mean, you talk about a lot, but two in particular towards the end here. One is Yongmi Park and one is Shin Dong-yuk. And both have published quite famous books. Both are quite famous defectors, and both testimony have turned out to be untrue in part. And North Korea have latched onto that in part untruth in some of their stories and use this to try and discredit all defectors out there. So I might get you to touch on those stories. You don't have to go into too many particulars, I suppose. But why might a defector have contradictions, lies even inside their own story, inside their own story, and this not affect the truth of their story itself, and then also touch on North Korea's response to these defectors and what that tells us about the country itself?
So North Korea loved when there were some inconsistencies, questions raised about these high-profile defectors. When there were some inconsistencies identified in their stories, North Korea loved it. Why did they love it? Because they were able to frame the defectors exactly how North Korea likes to frame defectors in their own media, right? Domestic and international, which is that these are human scum. They're human garbage. North Korea, when they represent defectors in their own state media, again, as I say, this is domestic and international. So North Korea made documentaries about both of these individuals, documentaries which are totally slagging them off, yeah? There is no ounce of goodness anywhere in these documentaries, in these representations regarding Yeonmi Park or Shin Dong-hyuk. There's nothing salvageable about either of these personalities. Yeah, they are 100% bad. So already you can begin to question the reliability of that narrative. The defector is an embodiment. Like if you look at Ji Sung-ho, who defected with his bodily injuries, or Shin Dong-hyuk, who showed his scars at the United Nations, or Yeonmi Park, who bears testimony about her mother suffering rape, so that Yeonmi Park was not raped as a child, as a young 13-year-old, I think she was at the time. So here you have the body, which is evidence. Yeah, North Korea doesn't want there to be any evidence. That's why they're not letting anyone in to investigate the crimes against humanity that are taking place throughout the country. But yet the body is evidence, and the voice of the defector is evidence at the United Nations. So they want to silence that as much as possible. They want to discount that as much as possible. So when anyone, for instance, you can even have very reputable academics, I won't name them, but who will say, yeah, there are some inconsistencies in the narrative. North Korea will blow that way out of proportion and make it sound as if that academic is now swearing off defectors, not having anything to do with them, and so on and so forth. So you asked the question about how is it that there can be inconsistencies? Well, there's any number of reasons. Again, I go back to the thing, human beings are fallible. The memory is fallible. I have 3 sisters. If you ask us stories about our childhood, it's amazing. It's like, were we in the same house?
Yes.
So there's that issue, that various people, various positionalities can remember a single event in very different ways. That's very human. It's very human to forget. It's very human for certain memories to come and appear in dreams or to appear as recurring nightmares. And for things to come back to us after a certain amount of time, perhaps post-trauma, that we then begin to build that memory or remember. But let me give you another example of why, for instance, when you're presenting something, like you and I right now in this podcast, you and I have decided, look, there's huge aspects of this book that we can't even begin to talk about. And then as I've said, I don't feel comfortable speaking, I'm more comfortable writing, yada, yada. Well, when Yeonmi Park gave her one of her earlier talks, it was really difficult for Yeonmi Park in this speech, which was about the human rights violations she suffered in North Korea. She's speaking to an audience, just of any, audience of people. They're not students who are experts on human rights, for instance, right? That absolutely wasn't the case. If they were students who were experts on human rights, then perhaps they could have accepted her telling her own story about the additional kind of weirdness that she got into when she was in China, where she was working at these kind of online sex cafes, and Yeonmi Park ended up involved in some human trafficking herself in China. But this demonstrates the gray zone of human rights violations. You're in a country that doesn't respect you as a refugee, doesn't identify you as a refugee. So, as Hannah Arendt says, and I reference in the book, you are outside of the law. And so you're kind of compelled to break the law repeatedly because you're not allowed to live within legality. So Yeonmi Park was a kind of stateless individual. She was in China trying to make money. She could make money the only way she really knew how. Let me work with these North Koreans who are these brokers who are trying to get people over, and I'll get some money and I'll get these resources. To an audience that's not, sensitive to how human rights violations imbricate, how they pull on each other, how people who are in vulnerable situations end up violating the rights of each other. An audience who can't accept that would find such a detour in her narrative confusing. Why is she, wait a minute, she was raped, she was trafficked. Why is she suddenly doing this? You know what I mean? So perhaps she decided, for whatever reason, she decided to leave that aspect of her story out. Some of this is too complex for people to grasp within a short 15-minute, 20-minute talk, et cetera, so that was one of the aspects of her story that was omitted, or let's say edited out, that was brought in later. And then in the case of Shin Dong-hyuk, it was like, can he remember the number of the camp, et cetera, et cetera. But substantively, what these individuals are saying about North Korea is true. There's absolutely the fact that their testimonies had some inconsistencies or omissions did great damage to the Human Rights Project and to defectors. And so that created a lot of animosity within the defector community and the activist human rights community. But as to the substance of what they were saying, there was no error. There was no mistake.
That is a really interesting an important point to touch on there, that idea that there may be inconsistencies here. There may be challenges. And, we tend to accept that some people in certain circumstances in their lives will have PTSD, but we don't apply it to North Korea. And you think of the horrors of life, what it must be like. And as you said, you can't remember growing up in your details. I can't either. I bump into old friends and they tell me stories. And again, I'm like, oh dear, I've forgotten all about that. But it takes some prodding to get there. And you can only imagine how bad that memory would be, or inconsistent, if I had a traumatic life. And I haven't. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And also that you then have the great pressure of having to speak not only for yourself, but you're being expected to speak for however many million. And none of us have ever been in the position few of us have ever been in a position where we're expected to do that.
Yes. And also with a constant understanding that you're being watched in North Korea, and you think, well, I'm not sure if I'm going to slip up and put someone else in it somehow, right? Every word you say could have implications.
And this aspect of the hunting that North Korea has, Hwang Jung-hyuk, North Korea tried to assassinate him so many times. Tae Young-ho, who's currently, if you've ever been in the presence of him, he's got guards all around him, and the man's whisked off into secret rooms. And the expense put to keep North Korean defectors safe is evidence of how much the regime wants to absolutely eliminate them.
So let's step into a couple of the final details here. This is important. I want to talk about what you mentioned as, and this is important to put some clarification here. You call it the Earthsat Civil Society inside North Korea. And in response to the Commission of Inquiry report, in November 2014, there was a mass demonstration in downtown Pyongyang. Now, this is not something you commonly hear, of course, but in Kim Il-sung Square, there's a mass demonstration of people. And as you mentioned, there are now, we occasionally get access with foreign media into North Korea on certain conditions. And foreign media was there and managed to interview people on the ground. And so I want you to take us to that moment, that civil society. And this is, I assume, North Korea trying to show the world that there is an active civil society inside North Korea. They disagree with the Commission of Inquiry report, but in what they said, there was such a huge flaw in the sense that there was this mass of people, and each person had the identical message, the exact same response, despite when they were slightly pushed or slightly asked certain questions, it was obvious that they hadn't read the report at all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so this for me was real evidence that the North Korea regime, or at least the propaganda operation of the regime, is watching very carefully what's happening in the international community with regards to human rights at the United Nations, and also modeling things that they see Russia and China very successfully doing to kind of smack down allegations of human rights violations. So if you'll just imagine for a minute, again, as I said, at the United Nations, the Commission of Inquiry asked North Korea, let us go in, see the prison camps, see whatever. If it's not the case, we will make it known. North Korea ignored the letter. So self-fulfilling prophecy. When they got to critique it, they said, you never came in. And they said, you only interviewed people who are defectors, human scum, they're liars. Well, according to North Korean media, you would never know if you read North Korean media that there are 30,000 North Korean defectors in South Korea. That, first of all, you would never know. You'd never know that there are almost, the numbers are a bit sketchy. We're not sure because we can't get into China to do the research safely, but, maybe 100,000, 300,000 in China, other countries. You'd never know that. You'd think that the Commission of Inquiry report was written with the help of maybe a handful of North Korean defectors. And every single one of those was a criminal, a rapist, a pedophile, a murderer. That's what the North Korean media says. And then in their documentaries, they also say as much. And But you see, these individuals are they're putting their voice up and they're speaking out at the UN. So what North Korea has to do, because they're, like as I say in the book, they've caught themselves in a kind of noose of rhetoric, because they're saying, oh, you haven't come to our country, you've only talked to defectors. So, of course, the retort is, well, let us come to your country, let us speak to people who are from your country. Of course, they're not going to let us in to do that research. And so they're offering us people who haven't defected, right? So they're offering us ordinary North Koreans, and which is fascinating to me, because if you do, as I did in the book, like this forensic examination of these videos, you can see that every single thing that these individuals are saying is lifted from North Korean state media, almost verbatim. Each of them represents a kind of sentence of the argument that appears. So you can hear there's the two coquet, appeal to hypocrisy. Oh, well, America should talk. I mean, they have horrendous human rights violations, racial violence in the United States. South Korea has a high suicide rate. At the time, it was Park Geun-hye in South Korea. Park Geun-hye is, a terrible leader. She let the Sewol ship sink and all those children died and all and so on and so forth. So they'll deflect. And so all these, then of course they'll come around to saying that in North Korea, we have excellent human rights. Our state sovereignty is the most important thing, and so on and so forth. And perfectly echoing the type of language that you hear at the United Nations, the state representatives who speak at the United Nations, and the type of language and arguments that appear in the KCNA, Korean Central News Agency's articles. But this aspect of the demonstration is really, it was a bit of North Korea was kind of stepping out a bit with that, because here they had video, they showed footage of this demonstration that was held in Pyongyang, in Kim Il-sung Square. They had all the individuals who were demonstrating. They all had placards which said things like, let's squash the human rights report. The United Nations and the United States are basically one. I mean, it's one of the classic arguments that North Korea puts forward. Yeah, I mean, they then did these interviews with the man on the street, which I talk about in the book, and one woman. And this is a classic kind of technique that you'll see in democracies, that, they'll say, well, what do you think about Trump's idea that, you should take X, Y, and Z for COVID or whatever, right? And people on the street will say, oh, I think it's a great idea. Oh, I think it's a terrible idea. Well, in North Korea, they did the same thing. What do you think? So they asked people, what do you think of the human rights report? And again, as I said, I did forensic examination. You could see the eyes moving. You could see by the way it was jump cutted, the way the audio was cut, that all the human error, the real humanity was being cut out, and what was remaining were the core messages that appear again and again in the media. And of course, we see this in a different way, but the same message is put through when Will Ripley goes in with CNN International and speaks with overseas workers. So, for instance, I've written to Will on Twitter and Facebook and asked him, but I've not received a reply. I'm not sure if he asked or if he was invited to interview these overseas workers. But that happened a few years after the Commission of Inquiry report of 2014. I think it was 2015 or 16, Leiden Asia Institute or Asia Center, Remco Brewer put together a report with his team that looked at overseas workers' human rights violations. And so North Korea was keeping tabs, and so they invited Will Ripley to come in and speak with some overseas workers. And of course, you could practically write the narrative yourself of what they're going to say. We were very happy to work overseas. It's an honor to work overseas for our country. Things like this, our human rights were not violated. So this is a chance for North Korea to put their own testimony on the world stage, particularly with things like CNN International. So this is in terms of human rights, this is both a risk and an opportunity, right? Because here we can see that North Korea is responding. We can see that North Korea is concerned. This is the first time that North Korea has received so much pressure in terms of its human rights. But we also risk kind of legitimating the regime, things like that. I mean, there's some opportunities here. So, for instance, North Korea claims that they have freedom of religion. Well, let Will Ripley go in and interview some people who are religious in North Korea. Let him go to different parts of the country and interview people who are religious. Let him ask them in detail about their about prayer, things like that. So like I say, there's some risk, but there's some opportunity. But the concern, of course, is, and what I think the North Korean regime hopes, is that some people who are perhaps not thinking critically, or perhaps, I mean, who knows? I don't want to be insulting, but just who aren't maybe thinking too critically, would watch some of this stuff on YouTube, for instance, and be convinced that things are fine inside there.
So, as a final couple of questions here, the first one should be, I want to get your clarification, or at least your thoughts on this, because you do hear a lot in the media, and you do hear a lot from people saying that things are improving in North Korea. But you finish your book with a quote from Thomas Quintana, the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in North Korea. And he says, and I quote, "Human rights on the ground in North Korea remain unchanged." So just from your perspective, having researched this for a couple of decades now in so much detail, what should we make of the human rights situation currently on the ground in North Korea? And should we give any credence to the idea that when people say it is improving? Is it improving? And if it is it improving from such a low baseline that it's not relevant? Or should we, I'm not sure, I'm going to ask you the question and see how you take thoughts like that and the current situation aside North Korea today.
So the thing that hasn't improved is access. So for us to really know if things are or aren't improving on the ground, I mean, for us to even be confused about that question, right, indicates that we need to get access. North Korea has never permitted that. That's something that absolutely needs to happen. I mean, they've permitted aid agencies to go in and stuff like that, but they're always, I mean, they're controlling where you go and what you hear and what you see, much like the regime does with the North Koreans themselves. So access is the key thing. The second thing is, how do we know whether or not North Korea is serious about improving human rights violations, like to improve the human rights conditions of people inside the country? What I say at the end of the book is, if North Korea were genuinely interested in improving human rights, it actually wouldn't cost them anything. They could actually save money. The regime could make money. The economy could improve if they were to let up on human rights violations. So, for instance, if they were not to commit public executions, if they were not to torture people who were refouled, if they were not to perform forced abortions on women who were refouled, if they were to permit people to open up businesses and cross into China, or request visas to cross into China. These are things that if North Korea were genuinely interested in improving human rights, would not cost them anything to do. They could simply do no harm, a kind of do no harm approach. And would they do that? They're not doing that. And they're not doing that because it would change the regime as they know it, which to me indicates that the human rights violations are intrinsic to the regime as it is. Many people don't want to admit that. But for myself, having spent 4 years writing this book, I'd expect someone to write the counter book to this to convince me otherwise, or to even try to convince me otherwise. So the basic thing is access. And again, with this COVID-19 situation that we have right now, I can't believe that things could possibly be improving in North Korea with that, because border crossing would be much more difficult. Misinformation must be rife right now in North Korea with what's going on in the world. Access to information is still a huge issue in North Korea. There's no such thing as a samizdat. North Koreans aren't able to generate their own kind of media. So for me, I would say no, I don't think things have improved. And there's a question about whether or not, with crops and everything else, what those are likely to be, the amount of resources that are likely to be within the country in the months ahead for food, what that would be like. So, I'm deeply skeptical.
So in a way, you've touched on my final question in a sense. So I kind of preempted a little bit there. I'm going to finish where you finish in the book, with hopeful change in North Korea and moments where you participate in some of these almost ceremony-like events where people send USBs and food aid packages up to North Korea either by air or by sea. And these things do happen all the time, and they're incredibly hopeful exercises. I mean that in a positive way, in the sense that you write as a quote from one of the people before he sends off with the activist leader. He says, a North Korean can live for a month or two on what's inside just this bottle. So for all the hopelessness that you think maybe it'll find the wrong hands or it won't make it there, if it just gets to one person, it can make a huge difference in someone's life. And that is where you finish the book off on. And it made me think of the question of, do you remain hopeful after all these years? So you've been doing this for a long time. You've been in the finer details of it, dealing with the intricacies of everybody's life. And as you said, the changes are not that hopeful on the ground. But I wonder about you personally. Do you remain hopeful of fundamental change in North Korea?
I do, because the thing is, if you look over the years at the growth of the activist movement, so for instance, Liberty in North Korea, Link, that group, the number of refugees who've been saved, the number of refugees who are now young refugees who are in America who have learned to speak English very well and are able to speak on their behalf. And 15 years ago, if you were speaking to a North Korean defector, if you didn't speak Korean, you'd be doing it through a South Korean. So it's very valuable for us to hear North Koreans speak themselves. These individuals are able to get information back into North Korea. These individuals are coming up with really creative techniques for activism, with technology advancing on from where it was 20 years ago. There's all kinds of great things. Of course, the regime cracks down on this too and has its own techniques for countering that. Of course, it keeps pace every step of the way. But yeah, and for me, of course, I work with a lot of activists, and it is disheartening. But it's disheartening because you know the situation's bad, but you have to keep going. And for me, whenever I've been invited to do, and they kind of like, I know at University of Southern California, and they invited me to do a sort of brief video clip about this book while I was writing it. And they paid me money to do that video clip, and all of it went into those bottles that was sent into North Korea. So, I think it's really important to not give up. And to keep trying to improve things until North Koreans inside North Korea can make the kind of demands that they want for the kind of government that they want once and for all.
So that is a wonderfully hopeful note to end the podcast on. As we both mentioned throughout the podcast, we didn't get to even touch on most of the book. I had to brush over so much of it. There is so much detail there. I'm going to link it below, as well as Sandra's previous book as well, which is Marching Through Suffering. So I do encourage people to go and buy them or find them in the library and read them for themselves. There is so much detail, and it's so comprehensive, but it does not read like the kind of encyclopedia that you imagine it would. It really reads like a narrative. It flows and you can't put it down. So Sandra's previous book is Marching Through Suffering, and the current one that we were speaking about today on the podcast is Dying for Rights, putting North Korea's human rights abuses on record. So on that, Sandra Fahy, thanks for coming back on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you so much, Jed. It was my pleasure.